Welcome. I am Professor Rajiv Jha, and this session is the first unit of your pre-PhD coursework on research and publication ethics. Today's topic, Introduction to Philosophy, may feel abstract at first, but by the end of this session, you will see that every research decision you make rests on philosophical foundations. We will cover the definition, nature, scope, branches, and the relationship between philosophy and research. Regardless of your discipline, whether you work in education, management, life sciences, performing arts, or law, philosophy is operating underneath your inquiry, whether you are aware of it or not. Let us begin with a brief map of what we will cover today. This slide gives you the 6 thematic parts of the session. Think of it as a railway map. Each station has its own character, but they are all part of the same journey. We begin with the meaning of philosophy, move through its nature and scope, then examine the 5 classical branches: epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, logic, and aesthetics. We will also explore Indian philosophical traditions, the relationship between philosophy and science, and finally, the direct connection between philosophy and research, which is the most critical part of your doctoral journey. Each section builds on the previous section. Do not think of these as separate boxes. They are dimensions of a single integrated inquiry into what it means to know, act, and create. Before we define philosophy formally, let us open with a thought experiment that philosophers have used for centuries. You have probably heard the question, if your cells replace themselves every few years, are you the same person you were a decade ago? This intuition is at the heart of one of philosophy's oldest puzzles, the ship of Theseus. A ship sets sail. During the voyage, every single plank is gradually replaced, one by one. By journey's end, not a single original piece of timber remains. Is it still the same ship? This is the question of identity and persistence, one of the foundational problems in metaphysics. Now extend this to your own discipline. In the study of physics, when we ask whether an atom retains its identity through nuclear transformation, that is a philosophical question sitting inside a scientific one. In theater and drama, think of a character like Hamlet, performed by 100 different actors across 4 centuries. Is it still the same Hamlet? The text changes through translations, the performance changes, the staging changes. The philosophical question of identity is inescapable. I must note that this very presentation has evolved through revisions, yet its philosophical essence persists. This is not merely a clever metaphor. It draws attention to the fact that ideas, like ships, carry the same paradox. In research, your own conceptual framework will be revised through your doctoral journey. The question is, at what point does it stop being your original research and become something fundamentally new? This is a philosophical question. Time to reflect. Think of one concept in your discipline that has been so thoroughly revised over the decades that its original meaning is barely recognizable. Is it still the same concept? I would be glad to know your responses to this question of reflection. Before we proceed to definitions, let us sit with one more provocation, a quote that challenges the very premise of teaching philosophy. Alexandre Dumas, best known for The Count of Monte Cristo, wrote something rather startling in 1844, that philosophy cannot be taught. It is the union of all acquired knowledge and the genius that applies it. This raises an immediate challenge for us in a classroom or recorded session setting. If philosophy cannot be taught, why are we here? The answer lies in the distinction Dumas is really pointing to. The difference between knowing principles and understanding how to apply them. In Hindustani classical music, a student of Khyal may spend years learning the grammar of a rag, its aroh, avroh, vadi, samvadi, and characteristic phrases. This is knowledge. But the moment the singer understands how to breathe life into the rag, how to use silence expressively as sound, that is philosophy in practice. The genius of application is not teachable in any conventional sense. It must be cultivated. This quote positions philosophy not as content, but as a capacity for synthesis and application. For PhD researchers, this is precisely what a doctorate demands. Not merely an accumulation of facts, but the philosophical wisdom to construct a coherent, original argument. Memory stores facts. Philosophy generates meaning. A question for reflection. In your own field, who is someone who embodies the genius of application? What is it about their work that goes beyond mere knowledge? Take time to think and answer this question. Now, let us formally enter part 1, that is the meaning of philosophy. Part 1 of 6, we now examine what philosophy actually means, its etymology, its scope of inquiry, and how it functions as both an activity and a body of knowledge. Every significant academic discipline has a name that carries its history inside it. Medicine comes from Latin medere, to heal. Pedagogy comes from the Greek pedagogos, the guide of children. And philosophy comes from the Greek philo, love, and sophia, that is wisdom. Literally, the love of wisdom. But love of wisdom is not a passive sentiment. It is an active, restless pursuit. Consider what this means in practice. Philosophy is a searching and inquiring into deeper values of life. It asks about nature of matter, time, space, causality, evolution, life, and mind. It asks about the universe, the human soul, the nature of God or the absolute, and how these relate to one another. It is the art of thinking all things logically, systematically, and persistently. And crucially, it is both an activity and a body of knowledge, not just a set of conclusions, but a method of arriving at that. In education, when a teacher asks not just what should I teach, but why does this matter and for whom, they are doing philosophy. In Hindi literature, when Kabir writes his dohas, his two-line couplets that pierce through orthodoxy to reveal the absurdity of ritual without inner understanding, he is doing philosophy. The love of wisdom is alive in every discipline that dares to question itself. Note that philosophy does not promise answers. As we will see later, Bertrand Russell argued that philosophy's value lies precisely in the fact that it resists easy answers. It raises the standard of justification from assertion to argument. An assertion simply declares something. An argument builds a case step by step, where every link can be examined and challenged. This move from assertion to argument is what makes philosophy foundational to all scholarly research. Once again, time for reflection. Take any belief you hold strongly about your discipline. Can you convert it from an assertion to an argument? What premises would it require? Once again, I will be happy to see your responses to this reflection. Let us now look at how the greatest thinkers in history have attempted to define this discipline and why none of them fully agree. Every major philosopher has defined philosophy from within their own intellectual tradition, which is itself a philosophical act. No single definition has achieved consensus, and that disagreement is instructive. Aristotle defined philosophy as a science that investigates the nature of being as it is in itself. For Aristotle, philosophy was the master science. It did not study physics or biology separately. It asked what it means for anything to exist at all. I'm sorry. Plato, his teacher, was more austere. Philosophy is the acquisition of knowledge. This connects directly to education, the philosophical justification for learning. Hegel aimed at the essential nature of things, not appearances, but underlying reality. Immanuel Kant brought it to cognition itself. Philosophy is the science and criticism of cognition. This is enormously important for researchers. Kant essentially says, before you can know anything, you must understand the conditions under which knowing is possible. In law, this manifests in jurisprudence, the philosophical examination of which law actually is, what gives it legitimacy, and how justice can be conceptualized. Bertrand Russell took a more empirical line. Philosophy is the logical study of the foundations of science. And Paulsen saw it as the sum total of all scientific knowledge. In management, the strategic thinking draws implicitly on philosophical foundations, asking not just what to do, but what kind of organization we are building and why. The conclusion drawn from all these definitions is that philosophy is an academic discipline concerned with the examination of fundamental principles of reality. But notice what is common. All these thinkers locate philosophy at the ground level, examining foundations, not just building on them. Every research project has foundations. Philosophy is a tool that examines them. Once again, time for reflection. Which of these 6 definitions resonates most strongly with your research area, and which challenges it in a way you find uncomfortable? Take time to think about these, and I would value your responses. Now that we have established what philosophy is, let us ask what philosophers actually do in practice. Socrates, widely considered the founder of Western philosophy, is credited with the declaration that the unexamined life is not worth living. This is one of the most quoted lines in all of philosophy. But what does it actually mean in practice? It means that we should not merely live, we should reflect on why we live as we do, what goals we pursue, and whether those goals are worthy. Philosophy is not about perpetually agonizing over every small decision. What it does is raise serious questions about how and why people behave as they do, and whether those behaviors and choices are justifiable from the perspective of society at large. In sociology, this is exactly what critical theorists do. They ask not just how society functions, but whether its structures are just, fair, and humane. In psychology, this maps onto the meta-level inquiry. What constitutes mental health and who decides? A pharmaceutical company that profits from diagnosis, a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, the DSM committee, or the patient themselves. These are philosophical questions that psychology cannot answer without stepping outside its own technical framework. Philosophy provides an analytical framework to examine ideas and competing claims, to test them for validity and justification. It elevates justification from assertion to structured argument, and it reveals hidden assumptions that we carry without even being aware of them. Norms, morality, and judgments form the core of philosophical discourse. In modern societies, and this is directly relevant to research ethics, philosophical reflection is what enables us to ask whether a research methodology, a publication practice, a, or a peer review process is truly fair. Without philosophy, ethics becomes more, or I would say, mere compliance. With philosophy, it becomes genuine inquiry. I would like you to reflect on this. What is one assumption in your field's dominant methodology that you have never seriously questioned? What would happen if you did? Quite challenging? Yes. Such are the questions of philosophy. Try to answer, reflect and answer this question. We move now to part 2, the nature and characteristics of philosophy. What makes it distinctively different from other disciplines? Part 2, we now examine the distinctive characteristics of philosophical thinking, the levels through which knowledge develops, and what makes a problem genuinely philosophical. What kind of discipline is philosophy, really? Is it conservative and tradition bound? Or is it radically open and dynamic? The answer, interestingly, is both. And this is one of its distinctive characteristics. Philosophy is related to the knowledge of reality and truth, but not the narrow truth of a particular experiment or observation. It deals with truth in its broadest, most fundamental sense. It may be conservative in preserving classical questions about being, knowledge, and value, while remaining entirely flexible in how it approaches them. It is dynamic, always evolving with human thought. It deals with the process of conceptualism, the formation, examination, and critique of concepts. Consider chemistry. Every chemist works with concepts like element, compound, bond, and reaction. These are not purely empirical. They are conceptual frameworks. What counts as a bond? What counts as a reaction? These concepts were philosophically constructed before they were empirically tested. Philosophy provides direction for the modification of behavior, which is central to education. When a curriculum designer asks whether punishment is an effective or appropriate tool in learning, that is a philosophical question with empirical implications. Philosophy even addresses the relationship between Atma, the individual self, and Paramatma, the universal self or absolute consciousness. This is not merely a religious question. It is a philosophical one about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the relationship between individual and cosmos. Philosophical ideas must be relevant and meaningful. This rules out pure abstraction for its own sake. A philosophical concept that has no bearing on reality, lived, scientific, or social, eventually becomes sterile. The best philosophical work is deeply engaged with the world it seeks to understand. Let us reflect. Name one concept in your discipline that you use daily but have never rigorously defined. What happens when you try to define it precisely? It would be very interesting to know such a concept from your discipline. What do you think? Now, let us examine 4 particular features of philosophy's unique outlook, dimensions that set it apart from every other discipline. When we say philosophy's outlook is different from other disciplines, we mean something specific. Its 4 distinctive orientations: beyond space and time, collective development, searching reality, and guiding toward salvation, each reveal a dimension of philosophical thinking that transcends ordinary academic inquiry. First, beyond space and time. While a sociologist studies a specific community in a specific era, and a chemist works with materials in a specific laboratory, philosophical thought aspires to universal applicability. Consider Rag Bhairav in Hindustani classical vocal music. It is traditionally performed at dawn, yet its philosophical content, the mood of devotion, the confrontation with impermanence, the yearning for the absolute, transcends the morning hour. A great rag is not merely a time of day prescription. It is a philosophical statement about human consciousness. Second, collective development. Philosophy does not serve narrow interests. It aims at the all-round development of humanity. Third, searching the reality of life. In Kathak, the classical dance of the north of India, the narratives drawn from Bhagavad Puran are not mere entertainments. They are philosophical explorations of dharma, love, devotion, and illusion through the medium of movement and rhythm. The nritya and the natya components of Kathak dance correspond roughly to form, expression, and meaning. The philosophers triumvirate of structure, content, and interpretation. Fourth, guide to salvation. Philosophy frees us from narrow socio-economic constraints, orienting us toward the liberation that comes through indomitable effort and self-sacrifice. What unifies all 4 orientations is that philosophical thinking always situates the local, the particular fact, the specific case, the individual experience within a universal frame of reference. This is precisely what distinguishes a researcher from a technician. Once again, time to reflect on this slide, on the content of this slide. In your own research area, what is the universal question that gives your specific investigation its significance? Please think and try to answer this question. This naturally raises the question, how does philosophical knowledge differ from knowledge we use every day? Let us examine the 3 levels. Most of us understand the difference between everyday knowledge and scientific knowledge. But there is a third level, philosophical knowledge, that both builds on and transcends science. Understanding this progression is essential for any researcher. Level 1 is common sense, the knowledge achieved through everyday observation. It is intuitive, informal, often shaped by cultural habit and belief. It serves us adequately in daily life, but it is frequently uncertain, inconsistent, and biased by superstition or social norms. If you ask someone 2 centuries ago why objects fall to the ground, the common sense answer would be that is where they belong. Level 2 is scientific knowledge, systematic, empirical, testable. It refines common sense through observation, experiment, and structured inquiry. Newton gave us the law of gravitation, not because objects belong on the ground, but because two masses attract each other in proportion to their product and inversely to the square of their distance. Science sharpens common sense and removes a great deal of noise. But science still has foundations that it cannot itself examine. Assumptions about causality, about what counts as evidence, about the purpose of knowledge itself. Level 3 is philosophical knowledge, logical, abstract, critical, and synthetic. It does not replace science. It interrogates its foundations. When quantum mechanics showed that at the subatomic level, observation affects the thing observed, that was not just a scientific result. It was a philosophical earthquake that shook our most basic assumptions about objectivity and measurement. In education research, the same progression occurs. A teacher's common sense about how students learn gets refined by cognitive psychology. This is scientific knowledge, which is then interrogated philosophically when we ask, what does it mean to learn? And for whom? Common sense is the foundation. Science sharpens it. Philosophy synthesizes, questions, and transcends both. For PhD researchers, you must be able to operate at all three levels. But it is the third that justifies your degree. Having said that, let us reflect on this aspect. Identify a moment in your research where common sense led you astray and scientific method corrected it. Now ask, is there a philosophical assumption beneath your scientific method that you have not yet examined? I'm sure you will be enlightened by answering this reflection. To make this concrete, let us examine a direct comparison between common sense and philosophical knowledge across 7 key dimensions. This comparative table is worth spending time on because it helps us understand precisely what philosophical knowledge adds to ordinary knowing and why that addition is so significant for research. Take the dimension of certainty. common sense knowledge is frequently uncertain and illogical. Philosophical knowledge is certain, concrete, organized, and logical. Not in the sense that it produces unchallengeable facts, but in the sense that its reasoning process is transparent and its assumptions are explicit. In commerce and management, consider how businesses routinely operate on common sense assumptions about consumer behavior. Assumptions that frequently turn out to be wrong because they were never subjected to philosophical scrutiny. Why do consumers make irrational choices? Because common sense psychology has never been examined philosophically. Behavioral economics, the work of Kahneman and Tversky, arose precisely from asking the philosophical question, what do we actually mean by rational choice? The dimension of superstition is equally telling. Common sense is often biased by cultural beliefs. What is acceptable? What is respectable? What is expected? In law, many legal principles that were considered unquestionable for centuries, such as the legal personality of corporations or the criminalization of certain behavior, were challenged precisely by philosophical argument. The dimension of changeability is perhaps the most important for researchers. Philosophical knowledge is not subject to change with space, time, and context in the same way common sense is. It aims at permanent, universal principles, even while recognizing that those principles must always remain open to revision. The key takeaway: your research methodology should be grounded not in common sense but in philosophical knowledge. Explicit, organized, examined, and defensible. Defensible is a very important term in research. In fact, each of these terms, from the philosophy point of view of your research, are very important, and hence this brings us to think, to reflect on another aspect related to this slide. Identify one assumption in your research methodology that may be a product of disciplinary common sense rather than philosophical reasoning. How would you test it? Once again, please try to answer this question to the best of your ability. One of the most distinctive features of philosophy is the type of problems it addresses. Let us examine what makes a problem genuinely philosophical. Not every problem is a philosophical problem. This slide helps us draw an important distinction that has direct implications for how you frame your research questions. A philosophical problem has four defining characteristics. First, it is not a product of inadequate information. If a doctor does not know a patient's blood pressure, that is an empirical gap. But the question of whether a patient has a right to refuse life-saving treatment, that is a philosophical problem. More data will not resolve it. In life sciences, consider the question of what constitutes life. We have extraordinary empirical detail about cellular processes, DNA replication, and metabolic functions. Yet, biologists still argue philosophically about whether viruses are alive. because the question of life itself is not purely empirical. Second, philosophical problems are intractable. They are perennial, unresolved since pre-Socratic times and persisting across cultures and centuries. What is justice? What is beauty? What is consciousness? These are not getting resolved by more research. Third, they are conceptual. The concept of free will versus determinism, for example, is not about whether a particular neuron fired in a particular direction. It is about the concept of agency and responsibility. Fourth, they are abstract, existing in the realm of ideas, not physical objects. In psychology, the debate about whether personality is stable or situationally determined is partly empirical, but also deeply philosophical. It turns on what we mean by personality and what we mean by self. Einstein reportedly said he would spend 55 to 60 minutes defining a problem before spending 5 minutes solving it. Philosophical problems require this orientation. They demand that we think rigorously about the nature of the question before we try to answer it. Having said this, let us now reflect on this aspect. The question I'm posing before you is, what is the core philosophical problem lying beneath your research question? Is it conceptual, normative, or metaphysical? Have you acknowledged it in your research design? Those of you who have yet not decided about their research area or topic can indulge in this thinking later on. We now move to part 3, the scope of philosophy, understanding the breadth of terrain that philosophical inquiry covers. Part 3, we now consider the vast research of philosophical inquiry, its origins, its coextensiveness with human civilization, and its persistence across every domain of human thought. When we ask about the scope of a discipline, we ask, what is the territory it covers? What are the questions it asks? For philosophy, the honest answer is everything. And this is not intellectual arrogance. It is a reflection of philosophy's unique position as a discipline that examines the foundations of all other disciplines. Philosophy is a vast area of inquiry where questions are asked and systematic, logical answers are sought. It is the expression of deep inquisitiveness of the human mind, restless and full of curiosity, until a satisfactory answer is obtained. Consider the tabla, the musical instrument, the twin drum percussion instrument central to Hindustani classical music. A student learning tabla will begin with tals, rhythmic cycles. Tin tal, da din din da, da din din da, da din din ta, ta din din da. Kehrwa tal, da ge na ti na ta dhin. Dadra tal, dha di na dhatu na dha di na dhatu na, and so on and so forth. The first level of knowing is practical and imitative. Reproduce the prescribed sequences accurately. The second level is analytical. Understand the mathematical structure of rhythmic patterns, the relationship between matra, vibhag, sam, and khali. But the third level, the philosophical level, asks, what is rhythm itself? Is rhythm in the drum, in the mind of the player, in the interaction between the performer and listener? Is it temporal or spatial? Can there be rhythm without consciousness to perceive it? These questions belong to the philosophy of music, aesthetics, and the philosophy of mind. They are unanswerable by drum practice alone. The scope of philosophy encompasses reality, knowledge, existence, ethics, beauty, language, mind, and society. Which is to say, it covers the full range of what it means to be thinking, feeling, and acting human being in a world. Crucially, philosophy asks the question that science cannot ask about itself. Why does any of this matter? Science describes and predicts. Philosophy asks about meaning and purpose. For doctoral researchers, the so what question, the significance of your research, is philosophical. So, dear participants, once again, time for reflection on this slide, on this aspect. Why does your research question matter? Not in terms of immediate utility, but in terms of what it contributes to our understanding of human existence, knowledge, or justice. From scope, we move to part 4, the branches of philosophy, the 5 classical domains through which philosophical inquiry is organized. Part 4, the 5 primary branches: epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, logic, and aesthetics, each with deep relevance to doctoral research and cross-disciplinary inquiry. Historically, philosophy was the mother discipline of all knowledge. From Aristotle through Newton's Principia Mathematica from Aristotle through Newton's Principia Mathematica, which was originally titled Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. All systematic inquiry was philosophical inquiry. Over centuries, 5 core branches crystallized. Epistemology asks about knowledge, what it is, how we acquire it, and whether we can be certain of anything. Metaphysics asks about reality, what exists, what the fundamental nature of existence is. Ethics asks about value, right and wrong, how we ought to act. Logic asks about valid reasoning, how to build sound arguments, and aesthetics asks about beauty and art, how we experience and evaluate the beautiful. Each of these has its own subdisciplines and its own engagement with virtually every other field of human inquiry. In the next 5 slides, we will examine each branch in depth with cross-disciplinary examples. Notice that each branch corresponds to a fundamental question every researcher must implicitly answer. Epistemology: what counts as valid knowledge in my field? Metaphysics: what entities am I assuming to be real? Ethics: what obligations do I have to my participants, my data, and my discipline? Logic: are my arguments valid? Aesthetics: how do I present my work with clarity and elegance? So let us start with the branch most directly relevant to research methodology, that is epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy you are most directly using every time you design a research study, even if you call it by other names such as paradigm, methodology, theoretical framework. Epistemology studies knowledge itself, not knowledge of any particular subject, but the nature, origins, scope, and limits of knowledge as such. It asks, what can I know? How is knowledge acquired? Can I be certain of anything? Two great traditions dominate the epistemological debate. Rationalism, associated with Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, holds that reason is the primary source of knowledge, that the mind, through pure reasoning, can arrive at truths independently of sensory experience. We are born with innate ideas that precede any observation. In Bharatanatyam, this maps interestingly onto the idea that the mudras, the hand gestures, for those who are not from dance, pataka, tripataka, ardhapataka, these are the single hand gestures. Anjali, kapota, karkata, swastika, these are the double or the combined hand gestures. So there are many types of gestures for devtas, for relations, and other kinds of representation in the Abhinay. So in Bharatanatyam, this maps interestingly onto the ideas of the mudras, the hand gestures. They carry inherent meaning that a trained audience can decode through shared cultural knowledge, independent of the specific dancer's biography. For example, in Kathak, so if we have a shared cultural knowledge, you know that I'm taking a ghungat or I'm opening the veil, the ghungat. The gesture for water, for elephant, for blessing, these are not learned from observation alone. They carry an a priori semantic load within the tradition. Empirism, by contrast, associated with Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, holds that all knowledge derives from sensory experience. Locke's tabula rasa, the mind at birth is a blank slate written upon by experience. This epistemological position underpins the quantitative research in education, psychology, and the social sciences. The assumption that we can learn about the world through careful, systematic observation. Kant attempted a synthesis. Some knowledge is possible prior to experience. That is rationalism. Yet, experience is required to give it content. That is empirism. This Kantian synthesis is the implicit epistemological foundation of most mixed methods research. Mixed methods research is the one where we mix quantitative as well as qualitative approaches. Your choice of research methodology, whether survey, experiment, ethnography, or discourse analysis, is grounded in an epistemological position. Know yours explicitly. So to help you out, a question for reflection: are you a rationalist or an empirist in your research practice, or a Kantian synthesizer where you mix rationalism with empirism? What are the implications of your position for the kinds of claims your research can legitimately make? Please think This is a very important aspect of your research journey. No doubt, when we do a doctoral study, it is termed as Doctor of Philosophy. The subject can be physics, chemistry, life sciences, performing arts, psychology, education, commerce, management, law, any other subject. But it is always termed as Doctor of Philosophy. From the question of what we now know, we turn to the question what exists, the domain of metaphysics. Metaphysics studies reality beyond the observable, the fundamental nature of existence, being, space, time, and causality. Its central and most perennial problem is the relationship between appearance and reality. Consider the central question: does the world fully reveal itself through our knowledge of it, or does a portion of reality remain forever beyond reach? Three positions emerge. The realist says, yes, what we perceive corresponds directly to what actually exists. The idealist says, no, reality is fundamentally different from appearance. It can only be known through a kind of insight or intuition that transcends ordinary perception. The agnostic says reality exists and sustains appearances, but cannot ultimately be known. There are inherent limits to human understanding. In Hindi literature and poem or poetry, the Bhakti movement, Kabir, Mirabai, Surdas, Tulsidas, is deeply metaphysical. Kabir's dohas consistently interrogate the relationship between the visible world and the invisible ground. When he writes about the pot and the clay, the wave and the ocean, he is doing metaphysics, questioning whether the apparent separateness of individual things is real, or whether it is veiled over a deeper unity. In Odissi dance, the very aesthetics of form is metaphysical. The sculptures of Khajuraho and Konark that inspire the postures are not merely decorative. They embody a cosmology, a metaphysical claim about the relationship between the divine and the human body, the microcosm and the macrocosm. For researchers, every research design carries metaphysical assumptions. A sociologist who studies social structures as real entities is making a realist metaphysical claim that structures exist independently of the individuals who inhabit them. Metaphysics is, as one scholar beautifully put it, a philosopher's paradise, because there are always more coherent positions to explore. For research, identify the metaphysical assumptions in your ontology before you choose your methodology. So, point for reflection: what entities does your research assume to be real? Attitudes, structures, meanings, forces, identities? Are those assumptions realist, idealist, or agnostic? From what exists, we turn to how we ought to act, the branch of ethics. Ethics or moral philosophy is the branch most immediately relevant to the course on research and publication ethics. It studies human values and conduct. What is right? What is wrong? what is just, and what obligations we carry. Ethics operates at three levels. Meta-ethics asks about the nature of moral claims themselves. Are they objective truths, social constructs, or expressions of personal preference? This matters enormously in law, where the entire debate between natural law theory and legal positivism turns on precisely this question. Does law derive its validity from morality, that is ethics, objective moral truths, or from the fact that it is validly enacted by a recognized authority, regardless of its moral content? Normative ethics provides the principles for behavior. Consequentialism, which judges actions by their outcomes. Deontology, which judges them by whether they conform to duties and rights. And virtue ethics, which asks what kind of person we should become. Applied ethics addresses specific real-world problems in contemporary research. These include issues of informed consent, data privacy, plagiarism, fabrication of results, dual authorship, predatory publishing, and the ethics of artificial intelligence AI assisted research. In performing arts, consider the ethics of appropriating a classical form for commercial ends. When a sacred performance tradition like Bharatanatyam, whose origins lie in temple ritual and Devdasi practice, is transformed into a stage spectacle or used for entertainment marketing, we face a genuine ethical question about cultural ownership, authenticity, and respect. This is applied ethics in the domain of art. And in medical and life sciences research, the ethics of informed consent with vulnerable populations, patients, children, indigenous communities is one of the most scrutinized areas of applied research ethics. So, ethics without philosophy becomes mere rule following. With philosophy, it becomes genuine moral reasoning, capable of responding to novel situations that no rule anticipated. Time to think and reflect. Think of one ethical decision in your research process, however small, that you made by instinct rather than by principle. What principle on reflection was guiding that instinct? I'm sure you would be able to identify at least one. From values, we move to reasoning, the branch of logic. Logic is the tool that makes all other branches of philosophy rigorous. Without logic, philosophical claims remain at the level of opinion. With logic, they become arguments that can be examined, validated, or refuted. Logic studies the rules of valid inference, the principles by which we move from premises to conclusions. At its most basic, if the premises are true and the argument is valid, the conclusion must be true. Two foundational types: deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning: all humans are mortal. Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. If the premises hold, the conclusion is guaranteed. Inductive reasoning: every crow I have ever observed has been black. Therefore, all crows are probably black. The premises support the conclusion, but do not guarantee it. One white crow invalidates the general claim. The philosopher of science, Karl Popper, used this distinction to argue that science never proves a hypothesis. It only fails to falsify it. I repeat, it only fails to falsify it. This is deeply important for research design, particularly quantitative research designs. In Kathakali, the classical dance drama of Kerala, the narrative logic of each performance follows a rigorous internal structure. The Abhinay, the presentation of emotion, follows rules of sequencing and cause-effect that are not arbitrary. The logic of Kathakali performance, how it builds emotional states, how the Ras theory of Bharata determines the sequence of 9 aesthetic emotions, is a kind of aesthetic logic. Understanding it philosophically deepens the performer's artistry. In the modern era, as the slide notes, logic has become foundational to artificial intelligence and cognitive science. Every machine learning algorithm is a formalized system of inductive inference, and every logical circuit in a computer is built on Boolean logic, a branch of formal logic developed by George Boole in the 19th century. For researchers, every argument in your thesis must be logically sound. Its premises must be true, and the inference from premises to conclusion must be valid. Logic is the quality control of your intellectual work. Hence, I would advise you to think on this aspect. Take your primary research hypothesis. Of course, if you have framed one, is your argument for it deductive or inductive? What evidence would it take to falsify your conclusion? From reasoning, we turn to the most experiential branch of philosophy, and one which is very close to my way of working and thinking: aesthetics. Aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that studies the nature of beauty, taste, and the philosophy of art, examining what we find beautiful, why art moves us, and how we evaluate aesthetic experience in both nature and human creation. The central questions of aesthetics: what is art? What makes good art? Is beauty objective or subjective? Can art exist independently of moral purpose? For a sitar player trained in the Imdad Khani or Meihar Gharana, the question of what constitutes a valid interpretation of a raga composition is intensely philosophical. When Ravi Shankar brought Hindustani classical music to Carnegie Hall and later collaborated with Yehudi Menuhin, critics raised aesthetic objections. Is this still Indian classical music? Has the essential aesthetic quality, that is the ras, survived the translation of a concert hall, a Western audience, and a hybrid musical context? These are aesthetic arguments, not merely matters of personal taste. The philosopher Kant distinguished between the merely pleasant, what gives sensory satisfaction, and the genuinely beautiful, which produces a kind of universal satisfaction that we expect others to share, even though it rests on subjective judgment. This distinction maps beautifully onto the difference between popular entertainment and classical art. Aesthetics also asks about the relationship between art and morality, a question central to drama and theatre. Aristotle believed tragedy purified the emotions through catharsis, a quasi-medical metaphor for the philosophical process by which art enables us to process different human experiences safely. In Manipuri dance, the Ras Leela tradition, the circular dance of Krishna and the gopis, is simultaneously aesthetic, devotional, philosophical, and erotic. Its aesthetic beauty cannot be separated from its spiritual and metaphysical meaning. For researchers, aesthetics also pertains to your writing. Clarity, structure, and elegance in academic writing are not mere style preferences. They are ethical and epistemic commitments to communicating truthfully and respectfully. Hence, dear participants, think of a performance or work of art that changed how you think about your research area. What did it reveal that a journal article could not? Having covered the 5 Western branches, let us turn to the richly diverse world of Indian philosophical traditions. India's philosophical traditions constitute one of the world's richest and most internally diverse bodies of systematic thought, spanning more than 3,000 years of continuous inquiry across radically different positions on nearly every fundamental philosophical question. The 6 orthodox or Astic schools, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta, share the common ground of accepting the authority of the Vedas. But beyond this, they differ profoundly. The Nyaya school developed sophisticated systems of logical inference, pramans, or valid means of knowledge that rival any formal logic developed in the West. Vaisheshika developed an atomic theory of matter that preceded Democritus and has striking resonances with modern particle physics. The Sankhya school's dualism of Purush, consciousness, and Prakriti, matter, represents one of the most sophisticated early attempts to address the mind-body problem. Yoga adds a practical and psychophysical dimension, not as exercise, but as a philosophical system of liberation. The 5 heterodox or Gnostic schools, Jain, Buddhist, Charvak, Ajivak, and Agyan, explicitly reject Vedic authority. The Charvak school is materialistic and atheist, remarkably modern in its insistence that only empirical evidence constitutes valid knowledge. The Buddhist tradition, itself internally diverse from Theravada to Madhyamik to Vajrayana, offers one of the most sophisticated analysis of consciousness, impermanence, and dependent origination. These philosophical traditions did not exist in isolation. They engaged in active, rigorous debate with each other for centuries. In Satriya dance, the classical form of Assam, rooted in the Vaishnavite tradition of Srimant Shankar Dev, the philosophical underpinning is entirely devotional, Vedant. Every gesture, every narrative is an expression of Atman Brahman relationship. As researchers in India, you are inheritors of this tradition. Your research is not value neutral. It carries the philosophical DNA of the tradition in which you were formed. Recognize it, examine it, and be accountable to it. Hence, I pose another reflective situation and question to you. Which school of Indian philosophy, orthodox or heterodox, most closely reflects the philosophical assumptions of your research? Do you think your reviewers share those assumptions? We move now to part 5, the relationship between philosophy and science. Two great modes of human inquiry that are partners, not rivals. Part 5, we examine the deep relationship between philosophy and science, what they share, how they differ, and why Comte called philosophy the science of sciences. Auguste Comte, the founder of modern sociology, made a striking claim: philosophy is the science of sciences. This was not a demotion of science, but an elevation of philosophy, positioning it as the integrating foundational discipline that makes sense of what all the individual sciences are doing. Philosophy and science share a great deal. Both are engaged in the pursuit of truth. Both are critical and reflective by nature. Both grew from a love of inquiry that is, at its best, impartial and disinterested. Science examines scientific method, and philosophy examines the assumptions underlying the method. This is not a one-way relationship. Scientific progress has repeatedly transformed philosophical thought. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species, it was not merely a contribution to biology. It was a philosophical earthquake that required entirely new frameworks for thinking about teleology, purpose, design, and human uniqueness. When Einstein's general theory of relativity demonstrated that space and time are not the fixed absolute coordinates that Newtonian mechanics assumed, it required a philosophical revision of our most basic categories of understanding. The differences, however, are real and important. Science uses experiment and observation as its primary method. Philosophy uses critical analysis and logical argument. Science aims to describe, predict, and control. Philosophy aims to interpret, find purpose, and assess value. Scientific conclusions are testable and revisable through empirical means. Philosophical conclusions are evaluated through the rigor and coherence of their arguments. Chemistry tells us that molecules are made of and how they react. Philosophy asks what we mean by a chemical bond, what constitutes a natural kind, and whether the periodic table is a discovery about the universe or a human construction. For researchers, your methodology is a partnership between scientific technique and philosophical justification. Neither is sufficient alone. A technically flawless study with an incoherent philosophical foundation produces unreliable knowledge. Please think about this and reflect. Has a scientific discovery in your field ever forced a philosophical revision? A change in what concepts you use or what entities you assume to be real? Let us now examine the values that make philosophy worth studying and what genuine philosophical progress looks like. Bertrand Russell, one of the 20th century's most rigorous philosophical minds, made an argument about philosophy that surprises many students. Its value lies precisely in the fact that it does not give us easy answers. In chapter 15, of problems of philosophy, Russell argues that philosophy liberates us from narrow-minded conventional thinking by refusing quick answers to big questions, by revealing just how hard it is to settle those questions. Philosophy opens the mind to new possibilities. It is an antidote to prejudice, not by telling us what to think, but by showing us how hard it is to justify what we already think. Philosophy broadens knowledge across all fields, inculcates ethical values, and develops the capacity to reason correctly. These are the three reasons we study it. In education research, this manifests as the capacity to ask why a particular pedagogy is considered effective, not just whether it works in a particular context, but what philosophical theory of learning, of child development, of social justice underlies the claim that it works. In management, the best organizational theories like Peter Drucker or Henry Mintzberg were not merely good technicians. They were philosophical thinkers who asked, what is an organization for? What is the purpose of management? These are philosophical questions with immense practical consequences. What does philosophical progress look like? Goldstein argues it consists in bringing to light the covert preassumptions that burrow deep into our thinking, too deep for us to be aware of them. And Rappaport adds two directions: forward-looking progress and backward-looking progress. Forward-looking progress, which examines the implications of our current beliefs. Backward-looking progress, which uncovers the assumptions beneath them. For doctoral researchers, both are essential. The PhD itself is a philosophical exercise. Backward-looking, you interrogate your assumptions. Forward-looking, you examine where your conclusions lead. Without both, a dissertation is merely a technical exercise. We arrive now at the final and most directly relevant part of today's session, the relationship between philosophy and research. Part 6, the heart of this course: how does philosophy directly shape research design, methodology, knowledge claims, and practice? This is where everything converges. Wilfred Carr's statement that research always conveys a commitment to philosophical beliefs, even if unintended and unacknowledged, is perhaps the single most important statement in this entire presentation for doctoral students. Notice the word inescapable in the slide title. You cannot do research without philosophical commitments. The only question is whether you are aware of them or not. A researcher who is unaware of their philosophical assumptions is more objective. They are simply less reflective. Their biases are not smaller. They are just invisible. Creswell's framework captures this well. Every piece of research involves three elements: philosophical assumptions, what you believe constitutes valid knowledge; strategies of inquiries, the general approach you take, that is qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods; and methods, that is the specific procedures of data collection, analysis, and writing. These three must be aligned and coherent. In sociology, a researcher studying caste dynamics in urban India must decide, do I assume caste is a real independent social structure that causes behaviors, that is a realist ontology, or do I assume it is a set of meanings collectively constructed by social actors. That is a constructivist ontology. These are not merely methodological choices, they are philosophical ones, and they determine whether you design a survey, an ethnography, or a discourse analysis. In education research on teachers' professional identity, the same choice arises. Is professional identity something a teacher has, like a trait, or something they enact, like a performance? The philosophical answer shapes everything from interview design to analysis framework. Philosophical reflection is not a preliminary luxury before the real research begins. It is a constitutive of the research itself. Every methodological decision is, at its core, a philosophical decision. So, dear participants, please think, have you stated your philosophical assumptions explicitly in your research proposal? If not, what assumptions are you making implicitly about the nature of reality and what counts as evidence? The final slide unpacks the four alternative philosophical worldviews or knowledge claim positions that underpin all research design. Every research design is underpinned by a philosophical worldview, a set of beliefs about the nature of reality and what constitutes as valid knowledge. Creswell identifies four major positions, each with its own implications for how you conduct, analyze, and write up your research. Post-positivism, associated with the natural sciences and most quantitative social sciences, assume that reality exists independently of our knowledge of it, that causes can be identified through empirical observation, and that knowledge claims must be empirically verifiable or falsifiable. This is the worldview underlying most experimental psychology and most quantitative education research. It produces statistical findings, controlled trials, and generalizable conclusions. Constructivism holds that knowledge is socially and historically constructed, that means is generated through interaction between people and their contexts, not discovered as pre-existing fact. This worldview underpins qualitative research such as ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory. It produces thick descriptions, narratives, and situated understandings. In sociology and in qualitative research on performing arts, for instance, studying how Kuchipudi dancers negotiate tradition and innovation, constructivism offers the most appropriate framework. Advocacy and participatory frameworks go a step further. They argue that research is inherently political and that it should be oriented toward empowerment and social change. Feminist research, critical race theory, queer theory, and disability studies all operate within this framework. They ask not only what is true, but whose truth is being represented and at whose expense. For researchers working with marginalized communities in law, health, education, or cultural practice, this framework is both methodologically and ethically essential. Pragmatism takes a different route. It judges research frameworks by their consequences. What approach best addresses this problem in this context? It is pluralist problem-centered, and real-world oriented, and it provides the philosophical foundation for mixed methods research. You must know which worldviews grounds your research, not to confine yourself to one tradition, but so that your methodology, analysis, and conclusions are coherent and defensible. Examiners will test this consistency. Dear participants, which of these four worldviews most honestly describes your research position? And does your current methodology actually align with that worldview? Or is there a mismatch that needs to be addressed? It's a very important reflection, a question that you should think deeply. This brings us to the close of today's session. Let me leave you with a summary of what we have covered. We have traveled a significant distance today from the etymology of the word philosophy through its 5 classical branches across Indian philosophical traditions, through the philosophy-science relationship, and finally to the direct connection between philosophical worldviews and research design. The single most important takeaway: every research decision you make is grounded in a philosophical assumption. The only question is whether you make that assumption consciously and rigorously or unconsciously and carelessly. Philosophy does not make your research easier. It makes it honest. I encourage you to reread Creswell's framework for the 3 elements of inquiry, to revisit the 4 knowledge claim positions, and to write a 1-paragraph statement of your own philosophical assumptions before our next session. That exercise is not preliminary, it is foundational. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions and reflections.